It's past midnight in Kansas City. A man is sitting inside a parked car on a dark street. The engine is off, and he is staring at a light that is on in a room on the second floor of a building across the road. He has been sitting in that spot for 40 minutes. He is not feeling nervous. Guys like him stopped getting nervous a very long time ago. Inside the pocket of his coat, there is an envelope. And inside that envelope is enough proof to destroy one of the most powerful criminal groups the American Midwest has ever seen. He understands exactly what that envelope means. He understands what happens to men who carry things like this. He knows what already happened to two other guys who tried to do what he is about to do. Still, he gets out of the car, because tonight, something in this city is finally going to be different. After decades of staying quiet, after generations of people pretending not to see, after millions of dollars were moved in secret from back rooms in the Nevada desert back to the quiet streets of Missouri, tonight, someone is finally going to speak. The light in the second floor window turns off. He walks across the street, and the story, which started long before he was born in the gunfire of the 1920s, in the hidden rooms of political clubs, and in the carpeted money rooms of Las Vegas casinos, is about to reach its most important moment. But before we get to that point, we have to go all the way back to the start. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from, and what time it is where you live. I love knowing that someone in London is watching this at 2 in the morning, and someone in Texas has it playing while they fall asleep, and someone in Australia is listening on a Sunday morning with their coffee. This group of people is something special, and you are part of it. If you are new here, welcome. This channel is your place for long, detailed true crime stories. Hit that subscribe button, tap the like button, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. It really helps more than you know. All right, the fire is going. The night is long, and the story is ready. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand the Kansas City crime family, you first have to understand Kansas City itself, because the city shaped the mob just as much as the mob shaped the city. They grew up together, tied to each other, each one helping the other survive. And you cannot separate them without losing the whole story. Kansas City sits at one of the most important crossroads in North America. It is the place where the Missouri River meets the Kansas River, where the forests of the east give way to the plains of the west, where the cattle trails coming up from Texas once met the railroad lines heading east. In the 19th century, Kansas City was a boomtown. It was rough, wild, full of ambition, and absolutely overflowing with money. The stockyards and meatpacking plants drew workers from all over the country and from across the ocean. Germans, Irish, Italians, Poles, Czechs, and African Americans all poured into this city, filling up neighborhoods that grew quickly and without much planning. They were crowded together in the shadow of the downtown skyline by the early 1900s. Kansas City had one of the most lively, chaotic, and corrupt civic cultures in the entire United States. And that is no accident. It begins, as so many American stories do, with the question of who controls the money. In the early decades of the 20th century, Kansas City was ruled by a political machine so powerful, so all-encompassing, so deeply woven into the city itself, that it became almost another name for Kansas City. This was the Pendergast machine. It was named for its founder, James Pendergast, and later run by his nephew, Thomas Joseph Pendergast, known simply and everywhere as Boss Tom. Thomas Pendergast was not a subtle man. He was big, broad-shouldered, and physically powerful, with a handshake like a vice and eyes that missed nothing. He ran Kansas City the way a feudal lord might run his land, always watching for complete loyalty. He gave generous rewards to those who served him and quick, harsh punishment to those who crossed him. His headquarters was a Democratic Party office at 1908 Main Street, but his power reached into every police station, every courthouse, every city department, every building contract, every liquor license, and every garbage collection route in Kansas City. Under Pendergast, Kansas City had a certain reputation. It was known as one of the wide-open cities in America, a place where vice was not just tolerated, but organized and protected. Gambling houses ran openly, prostitution was common, liquor flowed freely, even when it was against the law. The police, who worked under commissioners that Pendergast had chosen, knew which places to protect and which ones to raid, and they followed their orders carefully. For the Italian immigrant community that had settled mostly on the north side of the city, in neighborhoods around Independence Avenue and the streets nearby, this political environment was not just helpful, it was absolutely necessary. These were families who had come from Sicily, from Calabria, from Naples, bringing with them old-world traditions about loyalty, secrecy, and settling arguments inside the community instead of going to outside authorities. For the most part, they were hard-working people, grocers, barbers, laborers, and small business owners, but among them, as in every immigrant group of that time, there were those who had other goals, other skills, and other connections. And when Prohibition arrived in January of 1920, everything changed. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which banned making, selling, or transporting alcohol, is one of the most important laws in American history. Not because it worked, but because it failed so completely and so profitably across the country. The desire for alcohol did not drop by even one drop. What Prohibition did was remove the legal supply and hand the whole liquor business over to criminals. In Kansas City, the bootlegging business exploded almost right away. The city's location made it perfect. It was a railroad hub. Goods could come in from St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, and New York. It was surrounded by farmland. Corn mash could be made into liquor in 1,000 hidden stills across western Missouri and eastern Kansas. And it had a political machine that had already shown in 100 different ways that it was perfectly willing to look the other way for the right price. The Italian community on the north side moved fast. Among the first and most important figures to come out of this world was a man named Joseph Scarface Di Giovanni. Di Giovanni was a Sicilian immigrant who had been involved in the Black Hand extortion rackets that preyed on Italian communities across America in the early decades of the century. It was the criminal thing that came before what later became the formal mafia structure. He was tough, ruthless, and had political connections. And as Prohibition began, he put himself in a position as a major player in the Kansas City bootlegging trade. But Di Giovanni was a figure who was more important for what he represented than for what he actually built. The real builder of the Kansas City underworld, the man who gave it shape and order and power, was someone much smarter. His name was John Lazia. John Lazia was born in 1897. Though the exact date is debated, in Kansas City, he was the son of Italian immigrants and grew up on the north side in the neighborhoods where Italian families lived close together for community and safety. And from a very young age, he showed a mix of intelligence, charm, and ambition that made him different from others his age. As a young man, Lazia was found guilty of highway robbery and served time in the Missouri State Penitentiary. That time in prison might have destroyed a weaker man. For Lazia, it was a learning experience. He came out of prison harder, more disciplined, more focused, and with a network of connections in the criminal world it would help him for the rest of his life. By the early 1920s, Lesia had made himself the main figure in the North Side's criminal economy. He ran gambling operations, policy wheels, which were a type of numbers game very popular in city neighborhoods, as well as more traditional card games and dice games. He was deeply involved in bootlegging, and most importantly, he had built a relationship with the Pendergast machine that would become one of the most important political deals in Kansas City history. The arrangement between Lesia and Pendergast was simple and smart. Lesia would deliver the Italian community's votes to Pendergast's candidates. He would keep order on the North Side, settling arguments, stopping the kind of violent chaos that would bring unwanted federal attention, and making sure the criminal businesses under his control ran smoothly and quietly. In return, Pendergast would make sure the police left Lesia's businesses alone. Officers who might otherwise want to raid a gambling house or arrest a bootlegger would get quiet instructions to find something else to do. When Lesia or his men got into legal trouble, the right phone calls would be made to the right people. This was the basic agreement of organized crime in Kansas City, the joining of a political machine and a criminal group that would define the city's underworld for the next 50 years and beyond. Lesia was not just a thug. He was a community figure on the North Side. Many people knew him as someone who helped, a man who would help a struggling family pay their rent, who would find a job for someone's son, who would step in when a neighborhood kid got in trouble with the law. This was the usual pattern of mob generosity in American cities, the criminal group acting as an informal social service, filling the gaps left by the government and building loyalty in the community through acts that seemed kind. The fact that the money behind those kind acts came from threats, gambling, and bootlegging was something people found easy not to think about by the late 1920s. Lesia's power had grown so much that he was effectively ruling Kansas City right alongside Tom Pendergast. He controlled the Democratic Party on the North Side with an iron grip. He had connections to organized crime figures in Chicago, New York, and Detroit. He was, in the language of the time, a boss, a man of power and respect in the national underworld. The national underworld was itself changing during these years. In 1931, after a series of violent fights between competing Italian-American criminal groups, most notably the bloody Castellamarese War in New York, a young Sicilian-American gangster named Salvatore Lucania, better known as Lucky Luciano, put together what was basically a business reorganization of American organized crime, working with other forward-thinking criminals like Meyer Lansky. Frank Costolo and Vito Genovese Luciano created a national commission. It was a governing board for the major Italian-American crime families across the country. The families would run their own territories, but would settle major arguments through the commission instead of with violence. Kansas City was recognized as its own separate family under this system, with its own territory and its own voice in national affairs. John Lesia was its representative, but Lesia's time in charge would not last. On June 17, 1933, something happened that would shake Kansas City to its core and echo through the national underworld. It was an event that had nothing directly to do with organized crime, but it showed in the most brutal way possible the dangers of the world these men lived in. On that morning, a crowd had gathered at Union Station in downtown Kansas City. Federal agents were moving a federal prisoner, Frank Jelly Nash, a convicted bank robber, back to Leavenworth Penitentiary as Nash and his guards got out of a car in the station parking lot. A group of gunmen opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 4 law enforcement officers were dead, along with the prisoner they were trying to protect. The Kansas City Massacre, as it became known, was a national sensation. It was front-page news across the country, a turning point in the history of American law enforcement that would directly lead to the growth of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI and the federal government taking over certain crimes that had previously been handled only by state and local authorities. The connection to Lazia was indirect, but real. The gunmen were associates of his, part of the larger criminal network he ran, and while Lazia himself was not involved in planning or carrying out the shooting, the event brought an uncomfortable amount of federal attention to Kansas City's organized crime scene. Then, less than a year later, Lazia's world ended. On the night of July 10, 1934, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the Union Station shooting, John Lazia was shot multiple times as he returned to his apartment building at the Park Central Hotel. He was rushed to the hospital, but his wounds were too severe. He died early the next morning. He was 37 years old. His last words, spoken to his doctor as he lay dying, were reportedly, "Doc, I don't understand it. I've been so good lately." It was a line that held more dark poetry than the speaker probably meant. John Lazia was dead, but the organization he had built, the structure of power on the north side, the relationship with the Pendergast machine, the connections to the national underworld, the tradition of disciplined, politically connected organized crime, all survived him. It survived because it was no longer dependent on any one man. It had become an institution. The question now was who would fill the empty space. The years after Lazia's death were years of change and internal competition. Several figures moved to take control of the Kansas City underworld, and the process was not always smooth. There were murders, there were alliances made and broken. There was the constant competition between groups who wanted to take the organization in different directions. One of the men who came up during this time was Charlie Corallo, a tough, capable criminal who had been a close associate of Lazia and who took on many of the daily responsibilities after Lazia's death. Corallo worked to keep the relationships with the Pendergast machine going and to keep the gambling and bootlegging operations running. He was a capable, if not spectacular, leader, and he held the organization together during a time when it could easily have fallen apart. But Corallo's time was eventually cut short by his own legal problems. He was found guilty of income tax evasion and sent to prison in 1939. His leaving left another empty space, and then Tom Pendergast himself fell. In 1939, the great political boss, the man who had run Kansas City like his own personal kingdom for decades, the man whose support had sustained organized crime in the city and whose corruption had made it grow, was indicted for income tax evasion. He had accepted a $750,000 bribe from a group of insurance companies in exchange for influencing a state insurance settlement, and he had failed to report it to the IRS. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 months in federal prison. The fall of Tom Pendergast was the end of an era. It shook the political structure of Kansas City to its very foundations. The machine he had built did not disappear completely. Institutions like that rarely do. But it was permanently weakened, permanently tainted, permanently stripped of the bold confidence that had made it so powerful. For the Kansas City underworld, Pendergast's fall was a major blow. The political protection that had sheltered organized crime operations for 2 decades was suddenly uncertain. The friendly police commissioners and sympathetic prosecutors were gone or afraid. The organization would need to rebuild its political connections on a new foundation. More carefully, more quietly, it would need new leadership. And new leadership was coming. It was coming in the form of a man named Charles Binaggio. Charles Binaggio was a different kind of Kansas City crime boss than John Lazia had been. Where Lazia was charismatic and relatively well-liked in his community, Binaggio was harder, more openly political, more boldly ambitious. Lazia had kept a careful balance between criminal power and community respect. Binaggio leaned strongly toward political power, toward pushing himself into the workings of Missouri, state politics in a way that would either make him the most powerful man in the state or destroy him completely. He chose to try. Binaggio was born in 1909 in Louisiana to Italian immigrant parents. But he grew up in Kansas City, where he came of age in the same North Side neighborhoods that had produced Lazia. He learned the business of organized crime from the bottom up, the gambling operations, the bookmaking, the political connections, the careful building of relationships with law enforcement and elected officials. He was smart and he was energetic. And as the older generation of Kansas City crime figures aged or went to prison, Binaggio moved quickly to fill the space they left. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, Binaggio had made himself the main political figure in the Kansas City underworld. He ran the 1st District Democratic Club, which was his political base, and from that base, he ran a wide network of gambling houses and bookmaking operations that brought in huge amounts of money. But Binaggio was not satisfied with just running gambling and bookmaking. He wanted something bigger. He wanted something that no Kansas City mob boss had ever quite achieved. Real, proven control over the political system of the entire state of Missouri. His way to get this was the 1948 Missouri governor's race. In that election, Binaggio put all the power of his organization, money, manpower, getting out the vote behind a candidate named Forrest Smith. Smith won the election and became governor of Missouri in January of 1949, according to what prosecutors and investigators later figured out. Binaggio had put huge amounts of money into Smith's campaign with a very clear expectation in return that the new governor would put friendly men in key positions, especially in the state highway patrol and in the gambling enforcement system, in ways that would let Binaggio open large-scale gambling operations all over Missouri without anyone bothering him. The deal apparently did not work out. Governor Smith, once in office, either could not or would not give Binaggio what he thought he had been promised. The political protection that Binaggio had bought, or thought he had bought, did not happen the way he had expected. The gambling operations he had planned to grow were not protected as he had thought they would be. Binaggio was furious, and word of his anger spread to the national underworld. The men on the commission, the national governing body of American organized crime, the men who represented the major families in New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Los Angeles, were watching Kansas City very closely. They had their own interests in Missouri's political situation, their own plans for gambling expansion in the Midwest. And Binaggio had been, in a way, spending their money on his political adventure. His failure to deliver was not just a personal embarrassment. It was a business problem. In early 1950, Binaggio was called to a meeting in Chicago with the leaders of the Chicago outfit, the organization that had always considered Kansas City to be in its area of influence. The meeting did not go well. Binaggio returned to Kansas City under something close to a death sentence. On the night of April 5, 1950, Charles Binaggio and his close associate Charles Gargota were found murdered in the 1st District Democratic Club, the very headquarters of Binaggio's political operation. They had been shot at close range, execution style. Binaggio's body was slumped in his chair behind his desk. Gargota was on the floor nearby, The murders were never officially solved. No one was ever charged. No one was ever convicted. No one ever stood trial for the deaths of Charles Benaggio and Charles Gargota. But the murders sent a very clear message. The Kansas City crime family, the organization that John Lazia had built, that Charlie Corallo had kept going, that Charles Benaggio had tried to use for statewide political power, needed new leadership. Leadership that would be more disciplined, more focused, less interested in big political adventures that embarrassed the national organization and brought federal attention. The murders of Benaggio and Gargota were on the front pages of newspapers all over the country. A Senate committee, the Kefauver Committee, which was doing a large investigation into organized crime across America, took a special interest in Kansas City. The city suddenly found itself in a national spotlight. Its mob connections were exposed. Its political machine was further embarrassed. Its reputation as a wide-open city changed from a selling point into a problem. In this moment of crisis, of exposure, of real danger, the Kansas City crime family needed someone who could hold it together without making headlines. Someone who could handle the new reality, a post-Pendergast, post-Benaggio reality, in which the old ways of bold political protection were no longer possible. Someone smart enough to keep the organization's operations going while staying much quieter than his predecessors. They needed someone patient, someone careful, someone with a talent for silence. They found him in a quiet, watchful man who had been moving steadily through the organization for years, learning, observing, waiting. His name was Nicholas Civella, and the time that would bear his name was about to begin. There is a particular kind of power that announces itself with whispers instead of shouts. And Nicholas Civella, Nick to those who knew him, or Mr. Civella to those who did not know him quite well enough, was a perfect example of that kind of power. He was born on March 19, 1912, in Kansas City, Missouri, the son of Italian immigrants from the old country. Nicholas Civella came into the world in the North End's Italian neighborhood, crowded apartments off Independence Avenue where Sicilian and Calabrian families lived in tight rows. His father, Joseph, worked as a laborer and fruit seller. His mother, Maria, kept the house and raised 9 children. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of organs, women calling to each other from windows in dialect, and the clatter of streetcars. Young Nick grew up speaking 2 languages, deeply Catholic, and very aware that power in Kansas City flowed through Tom Pendergast's machine and through the quiet men who provided the money and muscle to keep it running. He grew up on the North Side, in the same neighborhoods that had shaped John Lazia and Charles Benaggio and the generation of Kansas City criminals before them. He was one of several Civella siblings who would play parts in the family organization over the decades. His brother Carl, known as Cork, would become a central figure later in the story. What set Nick Civella apart from the beginning was not physical strength or flashy charisma. He was a fairly small man, careful in how he dressed, quiet in his manner, methodical in everything he did. He had an amazing ability to be patient, to wait, to watch, to figure things out, to plan without showing his plans, to move without announcing his movements in a world full of men who talk too much. Nick Civella was remarkable for how little he said and how much he understood. He had been part of the Kansas City underworld since the 1930s, working his way through different positions, building relationships, earning trust. He was there, quietly, carefully there, through the Benaggio years, watching the disaster of that overreach happen with what must have been a mix of worry and calculation. After the Benaggio killing, the Kansas City family was in a state of real crisis. The Kefauver hearings were shown live on television. Millions watched as Kansas City figures, like Charles Benaggio's associates, refused to answer questions. The Senate report named Kansas City a well-known center of organized crime. Local police started raids. Mayor William Kemp promised to clean things up. Civella moved carefully. He kept operations low-key, paid off key detectives, and waited for the attention to fade. By 1952 or 53, he had built enough support to be recognized as the boss without ever publicly claiming the title. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1950 and 1951 had pulled mob figures from all over the country in front of a Senate panel and, for the first time in American history, had put organized crime on national television. Millions of Americans watched as underworld figures refused to answer questions and squirmed under questioning. The hearings created real political pressure for law enforcement to act against the mob in Kansas City. This meant that anyone who reached for the top spot in the organization was reaching for a position that came with a huge amount of attention. The police were watching. The FBI was watching. The Kefauver Committee staff was watching. Nick Civella took the position anyway, but he took it with an approach that his predecessors had not used. He took it quietly. He made no public statements, did not try to get newspaper stories written about him, threw no parties. He simply slowly, gradually became the person that everyone in the organization looked to when decisions needed to be made. The change was so subtle that even law enforcement was not completely sure of the timing, not sure of exactly when Nick Civella became the boss, instead of just a powerful member of the organization. That uncertainty was completely intentional. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Nick Civella built the Kansas City crime family into something more sophisticated and more lasting than it had ever been. He did this through a mix of careful organization, disciplined management, and a series of strategic agreements with other crime families that gave Kansas City a voice in national underworld affairs, far beyond what the city's size might have suggested it deserved. The organization under Civella was set up along the classic Cosa Nostra lines that had been made standard across America since Luciano's reorganization in the 1930s. There was the boss, Civella himself. Below him, the underboss, who handled day-to-day operational matters. Then the consigliere, the counselor or advisor, who served as a kind of internal diplomat and strategic thinker. Below them, the capos, captains who each commanded a crew of soldiers and associates. The soldiers were the men who actually ran the street-level operations, the gambling, the loan sharking, the labor racketeering, the various business enterprises that brought in money for the organization. In Kansas City, as in all American Cosa Nostra families, the actual number of made members, men who had been formally brought into the organization through the traditional ceremony, was fairly small, maybe 20 to 30 men at any given time. But around these men was a much larger network of associates, non-Italians, men who had not been formally inducted, but who worked with the organization, depended on it for protection or business opportunities, and added to its income, the main sources of money in the Civella era, at least in the 1950s and 1960s, were what they had always been: gambling and loan sharking. Gambling, especially bookmaking and the numbers game, was hugely profitable and fairly low risk if you had the right political and law enforcement connections. Loan sharking, lending money at interest rates far above what legal lenders charged, enforced by the hinted or open threat of violence, was another steady source of income. But Civella was also moving into labor racketeering in a serious way, using his organization's relationships with certain labor unions to get money from employers and to put his people inside union structures where they could control. pension fund investments, and other money flows. And more, his attention was turning to something much more profitable than any of these traditional rackets. He was looking west toward the desert. Toward the lights, he was looking at Las Vegas. To understand why Las Vegas mattered so much to the Kansas City crime family and to every other major organized crime family in America, you need to understand what Las Vegas actually was in the post-war years. Nevada had made gambling legal in 1931, but Las Vegas stayed a fairly small outpost until the late 1940s and 1950s, when a series of big casino hotel projects changed the dusty desert town into something truly amazing. The Flamingo, built by Bugsy Siegel with money from the National Crime Syndicate, opened in 1946 and became the model for what Las Vegas would become. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera. Through the 1950s, the Strip filled up with huge, glamorous hotel casinos that drew visitors from all over the country and created huge amounts of cash. For organized crime, Las Vegas was something close to a miracle. The casino business was a cash business. Huge amounts of physical money flowed through these operations every single day. Money bet at the tables, money played through the slot machines, money changing hands in 1,000 transactions every hour. And in the 1950s and into the 1960s, the rules in Nevada were much less strict than they would later become. The Nevada Gaming Commission existed, but it did not have the investigative resources or the political will to really look closely at casino ownership and operations. This created an opportunity. If an organized crime family could take control of a Las Vegas casino through a friendly front man who held the official license, through investments from mob-connected sources, through putting trusted people in key operating positions, then that casino became, in simple terms, a money-printing machine, not just for the legal profits that gambling created, which were huge in themselves, but for a practice that would become the defining financial crime of the Las Vegas mob era. They called it the skim, and nobody in America, nobody in the entire history of organized crime, would become better at the skim than the Kansas City crime family. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before the skim, there was the slow, patient, careful work of getting into position, of building the relationships and creating the footholds that would eventually give Nick Savella and those who came after him the amazing control they would have over Las Vegas for decades. In the early 1960s, something happened that showed perfectly the status Nick Savella had achieved in the national underworld. In November 1957, the town of Appalachian, New York, became the setting for one of the most important moments in American organized crime history. A large meeting of mob bosses from all over the country had been called, reportedly to discuss territory, the drug question, and the change in power following the recent killing of Albert and Anastasia. The meeting was held at the estate of Joseph "Joe the Barber" Barbara, a Sicilian-born mob figure in upstate New York. A New York State trooper named Edgar Crosswell had been watching Barbara's estate for some time, suspicious of the unusual amount of activity around the property. On November 14, 1957, as the meeting started, Crosswell set up roadblocks around the estate. What followed was chaos. More than 60 mob bosses and their men ran through the woods and fields around the estate. Many were caught and held. The names that came out of Appalachian read like a list of who's who in American organized crime, bosses and underbosses from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Florida, Texas, and elsewhere. Nick Savella's name was on the list. He had been at Appalachian. He had been identified, questioned, and released. His presence at this national gathering of organized crime leadership proved once and for all that he was not just a regional figure, but a full member of the national Cosa Nostra, a boss who sat at the table where the decisions were made. The exposure was unwanted, of course. It brought new FBI attention to Civella personally and to the Kansas City organization more broadly. J. Edgar Hoover, who had famously and stubbornly denied for years that a national organized crime organization existed, was now forced to admit the truth that his agents and state police had known for a long time. The FBI started a huge intelligence gathering effort against organized crime all over the country. But Nick Civella was not scared. He was careful. He had spent his whole adult life developing the habit of caution. He understood that the way to survive in his world was not to avoid attention completely. That was impossible for a man of his standing, but to give investigators as little as possible to work with, to conduct business in person instead of on the phone, to speak in roundabout terms, to keep few or no records, to operate through layers of middlemen through the 1960s and into the 1970s. As the FBI built its organized crime intelligence program, and as Congress passed new laws, including the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, in 1970, Nick Civella continued to lead the Kansas City family. He managed conflicts with nearby organizations, kept up and expanded his labor union connections, and steadily grew the organization's involvement in Las Vegas. He was building something bigger than Kansas City, something that would make his city, small as it was by organized crime standards, a player in the biggest game of all. One of the most important relationships Nick Civella built during these years was with the Chicago outfit, the powerful organized crime organization that ruled the Midwest from its Chicago base. The relationship between Kansas City and Chicago was complicated and sometimes tense. Chicago, with its much larger membership and resources, tended to see Kansas City as a junior partner at best, and there were occasional arguments over territory and sharing money. But Civella understood that a close relationship with Chicago was essential. Chicago had deeper Las Vegas connections than any other organization in the country. The outfit had been involved in Las Vegas since the early days of the Flamingo, and by the 1960s, Chicago figures were closely tied to several major strip casinos. For Kansas City to take part in the Las Vegas Bonanza, it needed Chicago's cooperation, or at least Chicago's acceptance. Civella worked patiently and skillfully to build this relationship. He presented Kansas City as a reliable, disciplined, low-drama partner. He built personal relationships with Chicago leaders, with figures like Tony Accardo and Sam Giancana, and later Joey Aiuppa and Jackie Chironi. These relationships were built on mutual respect and clear understandings about who controlled what. He also kept up connections with the families in New York, with the Genovese family and the Gambino family in particular. These relationships gave Kansas City a voice in the National Commission's discussions and, more practically, access to the networks of influence and power that the New York families commanded. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Nick Civella had changed the Kansas City crime family from a wounded, exposed organization into something powerful. It was leaner than it had been in the Pendergast era. You could not run the whole city the way Boss Tom had run it, not in the age of federal investigation. But it was more sophisticated, more focused, more strategic, and it was about to pull off one of the most brazen financial crimes in American history. The desert air of Las Vegas is warm and dry even at midnight. The lights, millions of them, neon and regular bulbs, arranged in every possible color and pattern, turn the night sky above the Strip into something that looks like a never-ending sunrise. Inside the casinos, the air is climate-controlled. Always the same temperature, purposely designed to make you forget the time and lose yourself in the world. The casinos have created a world of velvet and chrome, of ice-cold drinks and the warm sound of slot machines paying out, of felt-covered tables where the cards slide with a whisper and the chips click like tiny musical instruments. It is a world designed to separate you from your money. But there was a group of men operating from Kansas City and from Chicago and from Cleveland who had found a way to get the money before it ever reached the official record, before it could be taxed, before it could be traced, before it could be divided among stockholders or reported to the Nevada Gaming Commission. They called it the skim, and it was, in its own way, a masterpiece of criminal engineering. To understand the skim, you need to understand how a casino's counting room worked. Every casino had a counting room, a secure, controlled space where the money from the tables and slot machines was brought at regular times to be counted and recorded. Currency from the drop boxes under each gaming table, coins from the slot machine hoppers, stacks of bills from the cashier cages. It all came to the counting room, where casino employees would count it, record it in books, and get it ready for the official reporting process. The counting room was the casino's most sensitive space. It was supposed to be highly secure, carefully watched, accessible only to authorized people. The official records made in the counting room were the basis for the casino's tax returns, its reports to Nevada gaming regulators, and its payments to investors. What the skimming operation did was create a planned system for taking out a part of the cash before it reached the official count. Not all of it. That would have been too obvious, too noticeable. Just a piece, a significant piece, but a piece carefully measured to avoid raising immediate alarms in the casino's financial reports. The men who managed this process from inside the casino, the trusted insiders who had been put in key positions precisely because they could be counted on to take part in the scheme, would set aside packets of cash before counting began, or they would change the count sheets, recording less than was actually there, or they would use a mix of techniques that made it hard for any single check to find a pattern. The cash that was skimmed was then packaged and transported to Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee, the four organized crime families that were by the 1970s the main participants in the Las Vegas skimming operation. The size of this operation was staggering. Federal investigators who eventually put the evidence together later figured out that the skimming operation at its peak was making millions of dollars a year. Some estimates suggest the total amount skimmed over the course of the operation was in the tens of millions of dollars. Other analysts believe the real number was much higher. The nature of the crime, the whole point of which was to leave no paper trail, makes it impossible to know for sure. The Kansas City crime family's main foothold in Las Vegas was through the Stardust Hotel and Casino. The Stardust was one of the most famous casinos on the Las Vegas Strip, a huge property known for its enormous neon sign, its showroom entertainment, and its giant gambling floor. It had opened in 1958 and had quickly become one of the most visited properties on the Strip. Behind the Stardust's glamorous outside, however, was a complicated ownership and management structure that showed the mob's careful approach to keeping influence while avoiding official detection. The casino was, on paper, under the management of an organization called the Argent Corporation, which was controlled by a Chicago man named Alan Glick. Glick was a young real estate developer from Pittsburgh who had gotten enormous loans from the Teamsters Union's Central States Pension Fund, a fund that the Chicago and Kansas City mobs had huge influence over, to buy the Stardust and other Las Vegas properties. Glick from the mob's point of view, was a front. A technically legal businessman who could hold casino licenses and deal with regulators while the real power over the casino's operations stayed with the mob. Figures who had arranged his financing and who expected their investment, with significant interest to be paid back. The day-to-day running of the Stardust was handled by a Chicago mob associate named Frank Lefty Rosenthal. Rosenthal was a very smart gambling figure. He understood the casino business with an almost scientific exactness, and he had been put in the Stardust to make sure the mob's interests were protected and that the skimming operation was run efficiently. Nick Savella and the Kansas City organization were partners in this deal. They got a share of the skim based on their part in the Teamsters pension fund loans and their overall participation in the setup. The money came to Kansas City through couriers, trusted men who carried the cash physically, sometimes in suitcases, sometimes in other containers. Across the desert and through the plains to Missouri, the Fremont Hotel and Casino in downtown Las Vegas was another property with significant Kansas City connections. And the Hacienda, on the southern end of the Strip, was also part of the larger network of mob-influenced properties. Together, these properties formed a financial system that was, for a period of years, creating amazing returns for the Kansas City crime family and its partners. Let us pause here in the middle of the Nevada desert night and think about what this arrangement actually meant in Kansas City. Nick Savella was running a fairly small criminal organization by the standards of the major East Coast families. He had perhaps 20 or 30 made members, a few hundred associates, and a territory that, while well located, did not have the population of New York or Chicago. The traditional sources of income, gambling and loan sharking, were profitable, but they were not amazing. Las Vegas changed everything. The skim money that flowed back to Kansas City lifted the organization to a financial level that its local operations alone could never have supported. It allowed Savella to keep up a lifestyle and to maintain the organization's ability to operate that was completely out of proportion to what might have been expected from a medium-sized Midwestern city. More importantly, it gave Kansas City real power in the national underworld, the ability to access Teamsters pension fund money, which Chicago and Kansas City controlled together through their rule of the Central States Pension Fund, made them necessary partners for anyone who needed large-scale financing for real estate or other projects that cost a lot of money. This was power of a very real and practical kind. You did not need to threaten people when you controlled whether their application for a $100 million loan would be approved. Nick Savella understood all of this completely. He had spent years building the relationships and creating the footholds that made the Las Vegas operation possible. He was rightly proud of what he had built. But there was a shadow growing over Las Vegas and over Kansas City and over everything he had built. The FBI was watching. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's pursuit of organized crime had sped up a lot after the Appalachian disaster of 1957. J. Edgar Hoover, no longer able to deny the existence of a national crime organization, had started the Top Hoodlum program, which told each field office to identify and investigate the major organized crime figures in its area. Kansas City was among the cities targeted through the 1960s. FBI agents in Kansas City and Las Vegas had been building files on the mob's casino connections, gathering information, interviewing sources, trying to understand the financial methods through which organized crime took money from Las Vegas's gambling operations. By the early 1970s, as the RICO law came into effect, and as the FBI's organized crime investigations grew more advanced, the evidence was building, but building a case that could be won in court was enormously difficult. The skim operation was specifically designed to be invisible. No records, no paper trail, no witnesses willing to testify. The layers of middlemen between the mob bosses in Kansas City and the money flowing from the casino counting rooms were carefully kept, precisely to prevent any one investigator from seeing the whole picture. But then, in the mid-1970s, the FBI got a lucky break. The nature of that break and the amazing investigation it started would prove to be the beginning of the end for Nick Savella, for the Kansas City crime family, and for the entire network of mob influence over Las Vegas that he had spent decades building. The investigation that would eventually bring it all down was called Operation Strawman. Operation Strawman was one of the most complex and longest-running organized crime investigations in FBI history. It began in the mid-1970s and would not reach its conclusion until the mid-1980s. It involved FBI field offices in Las Vegas, Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. It used many investigative techniques: physical surveillance, financial analysis, informants, and eventually electronic eavesdropping. That together built a picture of the skimming operation, so detailed and so well documented that it would eventually lead to convictions against almost the entire leadership of 4 organized crime families. The Kansas City field office, working under Supervisor James Nelson, and later under other agents, who would become legendary figures in the history of organized crime investigation, slowly and patiently put the pieces together. They identified the couriers who carried the skim money. They followed the financial records that connected Alan Glick's casino loans to the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, and the pension fund to mob-connected figures in Chicago and Kansas City. They followed the money, but the most crucial tool, the one that would finally be decisive, was electronic eavesdropping. In 1978 and 1979, FBI agents working with court-approved warrants put listening devices in places where they thought Nick Savella and his associates were doing business. What they recorded changed everything. The recordings, hours and hours of them, gathered over weeks and months, captured conversations that showed the Las Vegas operation with an exactness that no physical evidence alone could have provided. They captured discussions of the skim money. They captured conversations about the shares going to Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. They captured arguments about people and operations at the casino properties. They captured names, amounts, arrangements, all discussed in the kind of open, specific terms that men use when they think they are speaking in private. Among the most important recordings were those made at the home of Nick Savella's brother, Carl Cork Savella. The FBI had gotten permission to put a listening device in the Savella family's home environment, and the conversations caught there were devastating, not just for what they showed about the Las Vegas operation, but for what they showed about the inner workings of the Kansas City family itself. Nick Savella, who had spent decades keeping his carefully built silence and discretion, was now being heard. The recordings proved his role as boss with unmistakable clarity. They showed him directing the organization's activities, discussing plans, settling arguments. They showed the relationship between Kansas City and Chicago in operational detail. They showed how the skim worked. The evidence was building. The walls were starting to close in. But Nick Savella was still free, and he was still fighting. There is a particular quality to the feeling of being watched that experienced criminals develop, a kind of sixth sense for it. They notice the car that parks on their street 2 days in a row. They notice the telephone repair van that seems to have been on their block for an unusually long time. They notice the slight change in the quality of the background noise on a phone call, the faint, almost unnoticeable electronic sound the surveillance equipment sometimes made in those years. Nick Savella was not unaware that the FBI was watching him. By the late 1970s, he had been a target of federal attention for over 2 decades. He had been identified at Appalachian. He had been the subject of intelligence reports and surveillance operations going back to the early 1960s. He had managed, through amazing caution and the careful keeping of distance between himself and the organization's street-level activities, to avoid being prosecuted for a remarkably long time. But the combination of forces now lined up against him was unlike anything he had faced before. The RICO law, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, had changed the legal landscape in a basic way. Before RICO, prosecutors had to prove specific criminal acts done by specific people. This was enormously difficult in organized crime cases where the structure of the organization was specifically designed to keep the leaders away from the actual committing of crimes. RICO changed the standard. Under RICO, it was enough to prove that a defendant had taken part in a pattern of racketeering, activity connected to an ongoing criminal enterprise. The boss did not need to have personally committed the crime. He just needed to have directed or profited from an organization that did. This was the legal weapon that would eventually bring down organized crime leaders all over the country. But it required evidence. Evidence of the pattern of racketeering. Evidence of the enterprise. Evidence of the relationships and communications and decisions that connected the boss to the organization's criminal activities. The electronic surveillance recordings were exactly that evidence. The FBI's wiretap operations in Kansas City in the late 1970s were done with amazing care. The agents involved understood that any mistake in procedure could make the recordings invalid and ruin the prosecution. They got proper court permission for each surveillance installation, documented their work carefully, and handled the recordings in ways designed to make sure they could be used at trial. What they captured over the months of surveillance was a complete picture of the Kansas City organization's leadership and activities. They captured Nick Savella himself in conversations that proved his role as boss beyond any reasonable doubt. They captured his brother Carl "Cork" Savella, who served as an important operational figure in the organization. They captured conversations with Chicago figures, with Las Vegas personnel, with local workers. They captured conversations about murder. In one of the most chilling parts of the surveillance, agents recorded discussions about possible acts of violence, the kind of open, business-like discussions about getting rid of problems that showed more clearly than anything else, perhaps could, the nature of the organization they were investigating. The recordings also captured something unexpected and, for the prosecution, extremely valuable. Moments of honesty in which participants in the Las Vegas skimming operation discussed how the skim worked in remarkable detail, how much was being skimmed, how it was being packaged and transported, who was getting what share, what problems existed at the various casino properties, what needed to be done to keep up and protect the operation. The agents working Operation Storming compared the Kansas City surveillance with similar surveillance in Chicago and Las Vegas. The picture that came out was of a coordinated, multi-city criminal enterprise operating with considerable skill and enormous financial impact. By 1981, the investigation had reached the point where decisions about prosecution needed to be made. The evidence was strong. The question was how to time the charges for the most effect. In April of 1983, Nick Savella appeared in a federal courtroom in Kansas City. He was 70 years old, and he was dying. Savella had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and by the time the federal prosecution of the skimming operation came to a head, he was a clearly sick man. The energy and carefulness that had marked him throughout his long career as boss was still visible in his eyes, in the watchful, judging quality of his gaze, the careful way he chose his words even in the hardest situations. But the physical toll of his illness was impossible to miss. He had already been convicted in 1980 on charges related to the Las Vegas skimming operation. He had been sentenced to 4 years in prison. He was released in 1982 because his health was failing. And then, in the spring of 1983, in the middle of more legal proceedings coming from the Operation Strawman investigation, Nick Savella, the man who had run the Kansas City crime family for over 3 decades, who had raised a medium-sized Midwestern city to a position of real national power in the underworld, who had built the Las Vegas connection that made his organization a player in the biggest financial scheme organized crime had ever created, died. He died on March 12, 1983, in Kansas City, Missouri. He was 70 years old. He died in his own bed, which for a man in his position was, in a dark way, something of an achievement. His death marked the end of an era, not just because he was gone, but because of what he left behind, or more precisely, what he was leaving his organization to face without him. The federal prosecution of Operation Strawman was not over. It was barely beginning. In the coming years, that prosecution would work through every level of the Kansas City organization. From the top down, it would produce conviction after conviction. Sentence after sentence, it would strip the organization of its leadership, its Las Vegas connections, and finally its ability to function. Nick Savella had built something remarkable, but he had not built it to last forever. And now, without him, it was about to meet forces that would test it beyond what it could survive. Let us talk about some of the other men who lived in this world. The lieutenants and workers and planners who made the organization work during the Savella era, whose names are less famous than Nick's, but whose contributions to the story are essential. Carl DeLuna was one of the most important figures in the Kansas City organization's Las Vegas operation. Known as Tuffy, and by other nicknames, DeLuna served as a key link between the Kansas City family and the casino operations in Las Vegas. He was deeply involved in the practical details of the skimming operation, the coordination of the counting room procedures, the packaging and transportation of the skim money. The FBI surveillance caught him in conversations that were among the most damaging in the whole investigation. DeLuna was a Kansas City native, born in 1931, who had grown up in the organization and worked his way into a position of significant operational responsibility. He was not a public figure in the way that some mob figures became. He did not look for fame. He did not have the kind of flashy personality that drew attention. He was, in the worker world of the underworld, a worker, a man who got things done efficiently and quietly. His efficiency would eventually lead to his downfall. The FBI surveillance caught him in enough detail to make him one of the main defendants in the Operation Strawman prosecution. Peter Tamburello was another significant figure in the Kansas City organization during the Savella years. He held a position in the organization's structure that made him an important middleman in various business dealings, and his name appears in the surveillance records and investigative files in ways that show the web of relationships through which the organization operated. Joe LaScala was among the figures who helped manage the organization's traditional Kansas City operations, the gambling and bookmaking businesses that had been the foundation of the family's income since the Lazia days. In a world increasingly focused on the Las Vegas opportunity, men like LaScala kept up the organizational base at home. The relationships with local law enforcement, the management of the crews who ran the street-level gambling operations, the day-to-day running of the organization's finances. These men, DeLuna, Tamburello, LaScala, And others like them were the connecting tissue of the Kansas City crime family. They were the ones who turned Nick Civella's strategic vision into real operations. They were the ones who showed up every day, made the decisions that kept things running, handled the problems that came up in any complex organization. They were also, finally, the ones who would be arrested, prosecuted, and imprisoned as Operation Strawman moved through its prosecution phase. The period from 1981 to 1986 was a time of one legal disaster after another for the Kansas City crime family. In 1983, even before Nick Civella's death, federal grand juries were bringing charges against members of the organization at a speed that had never been seen before in Kansas City. The charges ranged from the Las Vegas skimming counts to various forms of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Each charge required legal resources, expensive specialized defense lawyers, and created pressure on the people charged to think about cooperating with prosecutors. The threat of cooperation, of someone in the organization deciding that their own freedom was worth more than their loyalty to their colleagues, hung over the entire prosecution phase. The FBI and the Justice Department's organized crime strike force were well aware that a single cooperating witness from inside the organization could confirm the surveillance, recordings, and fill in the gaps in the evidence picture. And the defendants knew it too. This created a particular kind of tension, the paranoid, suffocating atmosphere of an organization whose members are all watching each other for signs of weakness, all wondering whether the man sitting next to them in the defense lawyer's waiting room might be making a different calculation, all aware that the surveillance recordings meant the government already knew more than anyone was comfortable with. It was in this atmosphere that Carl Cork Civella, Nick's brother, the man who had been at the center of the family's operations for decades, and whose home had been the site of some of the FBI's most productive surveillance, stepped into the leadership role that his brother's death had left empty. He inherited a kingdom that was already burning. Carl Cork Civella was not his brother Nick, where Nick had possessed a quality of quiet, controlled authority, a natural leadership presence that made men listen to him and follow him without needing shows of force. Cork was more unpredictable, more openly emotional, more reactive. He had spent decades in the shadow of his more talented brother, filling important operational roles, but never quite being the strategic thinker, the long-game player, the man who held the vision of what the organization was and where it was going. By the early 1980s, he was in his mid-60s, an old man by the standards of the criminal life, a man who had survived decades of dangerous existence through a combination of loyalty to his brother, personal toughness, and the good luck of being next to power rather than holding it himself. He had been a target of the FBI surveillance, and he knew it. He had seen the organization's finances disrupted by the legal proceedings. He had watched as colleagues and subordinates were charged one after another in the relentless progress of Operation Strawman, and now he was in charge. The position of boss of the Kansas City crime family in the mid-1980s was perhaps the most dangerous job in Americanized crime. Not physically dangerous in the traditional sense. The time of mob wars was mostly over, and the Chicago and Kansas City organizations were not in the business of killing each other. The danger was legal. The danger was the federal government, the FBI. The strike forced prosecutors who had spent years building their cases and who were now, with the evidence in hand and the charges brought, systematically working through the organization from bottom to top. Cork Civella knew he was in danger. He also knew that the organization needed him, or needed someone to hold things together, to keep some appearance of order and leadership in a moment of real crisis. He tried, given that, he tried, But the forces lined up against him are not going to be managed or negotiated with or waited out. In September of 1983, the first major strawman charges came down in Kansas City. Among those charged were Carl DeLuna, Joe La Scala, and a number of other key figures in the organization's Las Vegas operation. The charges detailed the skimming scheme at the Stardust, the transportation of the skim money to Kansas City, and the larger conspiracy involving Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. The defendants hired lawyers. The lawyers looked at the evidence, and the lawyers told their clients what any honest defense attorney who had seen the FBI surveillance recordings would have to tell them. The government had an extraordinarily strong case. The trial, known to history as the Strawman Eye Trial, took place in Kansas City in 1984 and 1985. It lasted months. The prosecution presented the surveillance recordings, the financial records, the testimony of cooperating witnesses. The defense did what it could, challenging the surveillance permissions, attacking the witnesses' believability, arguing that the recordings were unclear or had been taken out of context. The jury found DeLuna, La Scala, and their co-defendants guilty on multiple counts of racketeering, conspiracy, and related charges. Sentences ranged from several years to over a decade. The convictions were a huge blow to the organization, but the government was not done. Operation Strawman had produced not one set of charges, but two phases of prosecution. The second phase, Strawman II, would reach even higher into the organization's leadership. Cork Savella himself was charged in the second round of prosecutions. The charges against him related to his role in the overall conspiracy, his participation in discussions about the Las Vegas operation, his presence in the leadership of an organization engaged in the racketeering scheme. His trial was a brutal experience. The government played the surveillance recordings captured in and around his home, recordings in which he and other family members had discussed this organization's business with the kind of honesty that men use in their own kitchens. Recordings that stripped away the protective layers of distance and deniability that mob bosses rely on. Cork Savella was convicted. He was sentenced to prison. Given his age and his health, he too was in his late 60s and not in the best physical shape. The prison sentence was effectively a death sentence of a different kind. For a man of his years, the thought of years behind bars was not an abstract idea. But the law is not in the business of mercy for organized crime leaders. He went to prison. The flood of convictions that swept through the Kansas City crime family in the mid-1980s did something that decades of law enforcement pressure had not been able to do. It broke the organization's ability to work as a single unit. The leadership was gone. Nick Savella dead. Cork Savella in prison. The key operational figures who had run the Las Vegas connection were in prison or disgraced. The money flows that had supported the organization, most importantly, the Las Vegas scheme, had been shut down. The rules in Nevada had changed dramatically. The Nevada Gaming Commission had tightened its oversight, set up better procedures for detecting skimming, and was actively working to push organized crime out of casino ownership. The Kansas City crime family was not dead. Not yet. Organizations like that, built over decades and embedded in the social and economic fabric of a city, do not just stop existing when their leaders go to prison. The criminal culture continues. The relationships continue. The network of associates and partly legal businesses that the mob had built over generations continues. But the time of national power, the time when Kansas City bosses sat at the table with New York and Chicago and discussed their Las Vegas operations in terms of millions of dollars and nationwide political influence, that time was definitely over. The mid-1980s also saw the real end of organized crime's control over the Las Vegas casino industry. This was not entirely the result of the strawman prosecutions, though they certainly played a major role. It was also the result of wider changes in the Nevada rules and in the economics of the casino industry itself. The Nevada Gaming Commission had spent years, with increasing strictness, investigating the backgrounds of casino owners and key employees. The process of getting a license had become more demanding, more thorough, more resistant to the kind of friendly influence that had allowed mob front men to get licenses in earlier decades. Key mob-connected figures were found unsuitable for licensing and forced out of the industry. And the economics were changing too. The time of the single-owner casino, the Bugsy Siegels and the Allen Glicks and the Frank Lefty Rosenthals, was giving way to the time of corporate ownership, large public companies with stockholders, and seek oversight and outside auditing for buying casino properties and bringing professional management and real financial openness to operations that had previously been hidden on purpose. The Stardust itself, the crown jewel of the Kansas City mob's Las Vegas empire, was eventually sold and passed through several hands before finally being torn down in 2007. To make room for a new development, the building came down in a planned explosion, a great tower of neon and memories. Collapsing in a cloud of dust, it drifted over the strip and then disappeared into the desert air. It was, in its own way, a fitting image. While the strawman prosecutions were destroying the organization's top leadership, there were also significant internal conflicts within what was left of the Kansas City family. Any criminal organization facing the kind of legal pressure that Kansas City experienced in the mid-1980s inevitably faces questions of who will take over and who will stay loyal that become hard to solve when the usual ways of authority have been broken. When the boss is dead and his brother is in prison, and half the organization's key figures are either in prison or under charge, the question of who is actually in charge and who has the real authority to make decisions becomes genuinely contested. There were younger members and associates of the Kansas City organization who saw the disruption of the traditional leadership as an opportunity, a chance to move into positions of influence that they would not have been able to claim when Nick Civella was alive and in command. Some of these ambitions were fairly controlled and organizational. Others were more troubling. The period from roughly 1983 to 1989 was one of real splitting apart in the Kansas City family. Without the clear, respected, feared authority that Nick Civella had represented, the organization was unable to keep the kind of discipline and unity that had marked it during his time in charge. There were arguments over money, over who controlled what gambling operations, who had the right to collect from which bookmakers, who could authorize which loans. There were arguments over authority, over who could make decisions in the absence of recognized leadership. There were arguments that grew beyond disagreement into violence, including several murders of organization figures during this period. Each act of internal violence was, in addition to its immediate human cost, another piece of evidence for federal prosecutors. One figure who tried to step into the leadership gap left by the Civella brothers. Removal from the scene was a man named Anthony Civella, Nick's nephew and a member of the family both by blood and by organization. Anthony Civella had been involved in the organization's operations and tried to claim leadership based on family connection and organizational standing. But Anthony Civella faced the same problems that had beaten down every other figure in the post-Strawman Kansas City organization. He was under law enforcement scrutiny. He was operating in an environment where the traditional money sources had been disrupted, where the political and police connections that had once provided protection had been mostly cut off. where the national underworld relationships that had given Kansas City its unusually large influence were frayed or broken. He was trying to lead an army that had already lost most of its battles. The late 1980s brought additional legal pressure. Even as the strawman convictions were working their way through the appeals process, federal prosecutors in Kansas City were bringing new cases. Cases that came not from the Las Vegas operation, but from the organization's traditional activities in Kansas City itself. Labor racketeering charges, gambling charges, tax cases. Each new prosecution required more of the organization's shrinking resources. Each new conviction further emptied the pool of capable EXPERIENCED men available to keep operations running. And there was another development that may ultimately have done more damage to the Kansas City organization than any single prosecution. The change in the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. The pension fund had been for decades the mob's most powerful financial tool, a pool of money that could be directed to mob-connected borrowers, creating both financial returns and political power. The government's campaign against mob influence in the Teamsters, ending in a series of prosecutions and eventually in a legal agreement that put the union under federal supervision, steadily reduced the mob's ability to direct pension fund investments. Without the pension fund as a tool, Kansas City lost one of the key things that had given it influence in Las Vegas and beyond. It was like losing an arm. The organization could still function in a reduced way, but the strategic reach that had made it a national player was gone. The 1990s were the fading years of the Kansas City crime family. Not the dramatic fading of a spectacular sunset, full of color and emotion. More the quiet gray fading of a long afternoon turning to dusk, the gradual, unremarkable dimming of something that had once burned very bright. After the strawman convictions and the various prosecutions of the mid to late 1980s, the Kansas City organization was a much smaller thing. Its membership had been emptied by death, prison, and in some cases cooperation with federal authorities. Its financial resources were a fraction of what they had been in the Las Vegas skimming time. Its political connections, never fully recovered from the fall of the Pendergast machine, were now essentially gone. The men who tried to lead the organization in these years faced an impossible task. How do you keep a criminal enterprise going when the conditions that made it work have fundamentally changed? Carl "Cork" Savella was released from prison in the early 1990s. His health severely damaged by years of being locked up, he returned to Kansas City. But he returned to a city and an organization that barely looked like what he had known when he was an active part of its affairs. The Las Vegas connection was gone. The close relationship with Chicago, which had been the foundation of Kansas City's national standing, had been disrupted by the huge federal prosecution of the Chicago outfit that paralleled the strawman prosecutions. The younger men who were now nominally running things had grown up in the organization's smaller state and lacked the experience and the connections of the generation that had built it. Cork Savella died on December 28, 1994. He was 75 years old. With his death, the last of the men who had shaped the Kansas City crime family in its full power were gone. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, what was left of the Kansas City organization continued to operate, but at a scale and with an influence that bore no comparison to the organization's peak years. There were still gambling operations. There were still loan sharking activities. There were still men who considered themselves members of or associated with the Kansas City family, who did business under its name and kept up some of its traditional practices. But it was an organization in name more than in reality. The federal prosecution that had taken apart the Savella era, leadership had been thorough enough that rebuilding the kind of sophisticated, nationally connected enterprise that Nick Savella had run was simply beyond the ability of whoever remained. The men with the skills, the connections, the experience, and the vision to run a major organized crime family were either dead in prison or had been so completely identified and watched by law enforcement that any attempt to operate at any size was immediately seen. Law enforcement in Kansas City continued to watch whatever was left of the family. But the resources given to organized crime investigation that had been focused on Kansas City in the late 1970s and 1980s were slowly moved elsewhere. As the threat that the organization had once represented grew smaller, there were occasional arrests and prosecutions through the 1990s and 2000s. Cases involving gambling, fraud, and other criminal activities by individuals connected to the old organization or its remains. These cases proved that organized criminal activity in Kansas City had not completely stopped, but they also proved that it had been reduced to something different in kind from what it had once been. Not a united, disciplined, organized group with national connections and a sophisticated Las Vegas operation, but a scattered collection of criminal associations doing business at a purely local level. The Italian-American organized crime family that John Lazia had built and Nick Savella had perfected had, by the turn of the 21st century, effectively stopped working as a real criminal enterprise. It was not the dramatic ending that the movies might lead you to expect. There was no final shootout, no final confrontation, no last stand. It ended the way most things end, slowly, through the buildup of losses and reversals and the passing of time. Let us now step back from this specific story and think about what the Kansas City crime family story actually means, what it tells us about organized crime, about American cities, about the relationship between criminal enterprise and legal society. The first thing it tells us is that organized crime is not a foreign thing brought in from outside. It is not something that immigrants brought to America and forced on an otherwise healthy society. The Kansas City mob was made in Kansas City, built from the raw materials of poverty, ethnic tension, political corruption, and economic opportunity that were as American as anything in the country's history. The Italian-American families who formed its core brought certain cultural traditions from their homeland. The tradition of omerta, the secrecy and silence. The tradition of clan loyalty. The tradition of the strong man who protects his community in exchange for its support. But the organizational structure, the political alliances, the specific criminal businesses, all of that was shaped by American conditions, American opportunities, American failures of government and law enforcement. Tom Pendergast's machine created the conditions in which organized crime could grow. Not because Pendergast was personally evil. He was by many accounts a man who genuinely believed he was serving his community. But because the system of favors and corruption that he built created the structural conditions that organized crime needed to establish itself. The friendly police commissioners and the look the other way prosecutors and the fixed election results were not just political corruption. They were the frame on which the mob built its house. When the frame fell, when Pendergast went to prison, when the political machine was broken, when the clean government advocates and the federal investigators began to actually enforce the law, the mob had to find new ways to protect itself. And it found them. It found them in labor unions, in Las Vegas casinos, in the skillful use of legal front men and financial structures that gave the organization the look of being legal. This ability to change is the second thing the Kansas City story tells us. Organized crime is remarkably able to change. It responds to legal and social changes by finding new methods, new places, new opportunities. The change from Prohibition-era bootlegging to post-war gambling to Las Vegas skimming operations was not a single plan that someone drew up in advance. It was a series of changes, of responses to changing conditions, of business-like opportunism on the part of criminal leaders who were, whatever their other faults, genuinely smart and capable managers. Nick Savella's genius, if genius is not too strong a word for it, was exactly this ability to change. He understood that the old model of open political protection was finished. He understood that the new model required skill, discipline, and the kind of careful financial structuring that would make mob interests invisible in the legal economy. He built an organization suited to that new model. He also built an organization that finally could not survive the technology and legal changes that the federal government brought to bear in the 1970s and 1980s. The electronic surveillance abilities that the FBI used against the Kansas City organization in the Operation Strawman investigation were simply beyond his ability to fight. He could tell his men to be careful on the phone. He could hold meetings in person instead of by telephone. But he could not stop the FBI from putting microphones in the rooms where those meetings took place. The third thing the Kansas City story tells us is about the human cost of the underworld, a cost that is easy to overlook when you are telling the story in the movie-like terms it deserves. With all its atmosphere and drama and character, the human cost is real, and it is large. It includes, most clearly, the victims of the organization's violence, the men who were killed by Kansas City crime figures over the decades, the victims of the organization's loan sharks, the workers whose unions were corrupted and whose pension funds were stolen, the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund, which the mob directed into mob-connected investments and drained through various schemes, was supposed to provide retirement security to hundreds of thousands of working people. The money the mob took out of it came directly from those workers' retirement savings. The human cost includes the criminal justice system's investment in chasing these cases, the decades of FBI investigation, the trials, the prison resources. And it includes something harder to measure, but very real: the effect on the honest civic life of Kansas City. A city where organized crime has deep roots in the political structure is a city where resources are given to the wrong things, where merit is not rewarded, where honest businesses compete on an uneven field against competitors who have the mob support. The corruption that organized crime needs and keeps up causes real damage to the communities it lives in. Now, let us spend some time with some of the specific human details of this story, the moments and people that bring it to life beyond the organizational chart. Think about Nick Savella in the late 1970s as the FBI's net was tightening. He was in his mid-60s, a man who had spent literally his entire adult life navigating the particular minefield of organized crime leadership in America. Always careful, always controlled, always aware of the watchers. And now the watchers were inside the rooms where he met. They were inside the conversations he had thought were private. How does a man like that feel in that moment? Not panic. Nick Savella was not a man who panicked, but something harder than panic. Perhaps the cold understanding that the thing you had worked your whole life to build might not survive. The knowledge that the careful, patient building of decades, the relationships, the systems, the organizational structure was now exposed in a way that might prove deadly. He fought it. He hired lawyers. He challenged the surveillance permissions. He kept up for as long as he possibly could the discipline and the silence that had protected him for so many years. Even at trial, even in his final years, Nick Savella did not become a cooperating witness. He did not trade stories about his colleagues for a shorter sentence. Whatever else he was, he held to the code of silence that was the organized crime world's most basic rule. there is something almost sad about that. The intelligence and the discipline used in the service of something that from the outside was clearly wrong, clearly harmful, clearly going to be judged by history in the harshest terms. A man of Nick Savella's abilities, had he used them differently, might have built something legal and lasting. Instead, he built an empire of criminal activity that finally consumed itself and those closest to him. Think about Carl de Luna, Tuffy, sitting in a room listening to federal prosecutors play recordings of his own voice, discussing the details of a multi-million-dollar criminal scheme. A man who had spent his life working carefully, operating precisely, keeping the kind of secrecy that the organization demanded, hearing himself on tape, knowing that the careful, private work of decades was now public, documented, allowed in court. Think about the couriers, the men who drove the skim money from Las Vegas to Kansas City, crossing the desert and the mountains and the plains, with suitcases or bags or other containers, holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Ordinary-seeming men doing a very specific and very dangerous job. How many times did they drive that route? What did they think about as they crossed the Nevada border? As they passed through Utah? As they drove across Kansas toward home? Did it feel routine after a while? Or did the weight of what they were carrying never quite become ordinary? Think about Frank Lefty Rosenthal, the Chicago-connected casino operator who ran the Stardust for the mob. The man who is fictionally portrayed in the movie Casino, sitting in his Las Vegas office and managing a huge glamorous casino enterprise, while knowing that its real purpose was to send money to criminal organizations in 4 Midwestern cities. He was a gambling genius. He understood the casino business better than almost anyone in Nevada. And he was, in the language of the FBI, a main figure in one of the largest financial crimes in American history. Rosenthal himself was never convicted of a crime related to the Las Vegas operation, largely because the evidence against him, while large in the FBI's files, was not put together in a way that led to prosecution. But he was finally forced out of Nevada by gaming regulators, who found him unsuitable for a license. And he spent the rest of his life essentially away from the industry he had ruled. Let us talk about one specific event that shows the whole story in a small way. In 1975, a man named Jay Vandermark disappeared. Vandermark was a slot machine employee at the Stardust. One of the men involved in the practical details of taking cash from the slot machines before it reached the official count. He had taken part in the skimming operation, and by the mid-1970s had become a possible risk. Someone who knew too much and who had, by some accounts, been stealing not just for the organization, but for himself. When Vandermark disappeared, the organized crime world did not mourn. His disappearance sent a very clear message to everyone else involved in the operation about the results of being disloyal or acting on your own. It was the kind of message that does not need words, that does not need explanation, that communicates itself with absolute clarity through the simple fact of a man's absence. His body was never found. This is the dark side of the casino glamour, the violence or the threat of it that supported the whole operation. Not constant, not theatrical, not the way the movies sometimes show it, but real, always there as a possibility. The clear understanding that the men who ran this operation took it seriously, that they protected it seriously, that they dealt with threats to it seriously. The millions of dollars flowing from those Las Vegas counting rooms to Kansas City and Chicago and Cleveland were sustained finally by this kind of violence or the believable threat of it. You cannot understand the money without understanding the violence. You cannot understand the organization without understanding that at its base, beneath all the political skill and the legal front men and the financial structures, was the willingness to hurt people who got in the way. Operation Strawman did not just prosecute Kansas City and its partners. It echoed through the entire national organized crime network. The parallel prosecutions in Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee produced convictions against key figures in all four cities. The Chicago outfit, which had been the most powerful organized crime organization in the Midwest for generations, saw its leadership destroyed by the Strawman prosecutions and by parallel investigations. Joey Aiuppa, the Chicago boss, was convicted. Jackie Chironi, the underboss, was convicted. Angelo LaPietra, a key Chicago capo, was convicted in Milwaukee. Boss Frank Balistrieri was convicted. In Cleveland, Angelo Leonardo, the boss, became one of the most important mob turncoats in American history, cooperating with federal prosecutors and providing testimony that filled in gaps in the government's case that surveillance alone could not have covered. Leonardo's cooperation was a turning point. He was a boss, not a soldier or an associate, not a minor figure, but one of the most senior figures in American organized crime. His decision to cooperate broke one of the most basic supports of the mob world, the idea that the code of silence was absolute, that bosses did not talk, that the organization could trust its own leaders not to betray it. If a boss could cooperate, anyone could cooperate. This understanding, spreading through the remains of organized crime families across the Midwest and beyond, sped up the loss of spirit in breaking apart that was already well along by the mid-1980s. Let us think about the community that organized crime lived in Kansas City, the North Side neighborhoods, the Italian-American area that had been the foundation of the organization from the beginning. By the 1990s, those neighborhoods had changed enormously. The close Italian-American community that had supported the mob through its decades of power had scattered, moved to suburbs, married outside the group, blended into the wider American middle class. The social conditions that had made the mob's form of community help valuable, the isolation, the language barriers, the distrust of outside institutions, had mostly dissolved. The mob had always depended, at least partly, on the loyalty and silence of the community it came from. When Lazia had helped the family pay their rent or talk to the police on behalf of a neighborhood kid, he was building a social deal, help in exchange for loyalty. But by the time that community no longer needed the mob's help, no longer depended on it for access to resources and protection, the social deal dissolved. The mob became, in the eyes of most Italian Americans in Kansas City and across the country, not a source of community protection, but an embarrassment, a leftover from the old country's dark traditions, a twisting of the immigrant experience that had been used to mark an entire ethnic group. The legal Italian-American community did not mourn the fall of the Kansas City crime family. They had not been waiting for it to happen. But when it did, there was no grief. There was, for many, relief. Now we should talk about what actually remains. The Kansas City crime family exists in the strict organizational sense as at best a minor criminal operation with none of the reach, resources, or national connections of what came before. Law enforcement in Kansas City still sometimes identifies individuals with connections to the old organization, still watches activity in areas where mob-associated businesses have historically operated, still traces the family line of criminal relationships that link current figures to the organizational structures of the past. But the thing they are watching is a ghost of what it was. There are no Las Vegas connections. There are no Teamsters pension fund operations. There is no commission representation. There is no network of political protection. No friendly police commissioners. No cooperative prosecutors. There is no organization capable of creating the kind of disciplined, coordinated criminal activity that marked the family in its prime. What remains are individuals, some of them descendants of mob figures, some of them old men who were associated with the organization in their youth, some of them third-generation criminals who know the family's history as a kind of mythology. They may run gambling operations, take part in fraud, be involved in various local criminal enterprises, but they do so without the organizational machinery that once gave Kansas City organized crime its power. The Stardust is gone, torn down in 2007. The Fremont still stands in downtown Las Vegas, but under legal corporate ownership, with none of the mob connections of its past. The hacienda was torn down in 1996, replaced by a new development. The counting rooms where the skim was taken have been rebuilt, watched, regulated beyond anything that would have been recognizable to the men who used them. The old North Side neighborhoods of Kansas City have changed. The descendants of the Italian-American families who built the mob's social base are suburban professionals. Executives, teachers, doctors, lawyers, people for whom the world their grandparents lived in is history rather than reality. The Pendergast machine is long gone. The Union Station massacre is now a museum exhibit. The First District Democratic Club, where Charles Binaggio was murdered, is a memory. Time moves on, but before we finish, we should spend some time with two figures whose stories show the human side of this history in particular ways. The first is Nick Savella's legacy, considered honestly. Nick Savella was by any objective measure a criminal. He took part in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the Las Vegas skimming operation, crimes that caused real harm to real people. He led an organization that was at its core kept up by the threat and sometimes the reality of violence. He made huge profits from the use of legal weaknesses and political corruption. And yet there is a complexity to the man that history demands we acknowledge. He was, by the accounts of those who dealt with him on both sides of the law, a man of intelligence and discipline and a certain dark honor. He kept his word. He ran his organization with a real commitment to his rules. His rules, to be sure, rules that served his interests and the interests of his organization, but rules nonetheless. He was not someone who enjoyed hurting others. He did not kill for pleasure. He used violence as a tool, not often by mob standards, and always with a calculation of whether it was necessary. He was a man who was shaped by his time and his world into something that was finally a product of American conditions as much as of personal choice. Born in a different year, in a different neighborhood, with access to different opportunities, what might Nick Savella have built? What legal organization might have benefited from his gifts for leadership, for patience, for strategic thinking? We will never know. History is not interested in different versions of itself. The second figure whose story deserves thought is someone who is in many ways the most important character in the whole story. The unknown FBI agent, not any particular agent, though there were many particular agents working in Kansas City and Las Vegas and Chicago and Cleveland, whose work over decades produced the evidence that brought the strawman prosecutions to their successful ends. But the combined figure of the federal investigator, the man or woman who shows up at the office at 7 in the morning and stays until 9 at night, putting together records, looking over surveillance transcripts, building a case one document at a time over months and years, who carries out court-approved searches and installations with careful attention to doing things right, because any mistake would ruin years of work, who interviews witnesses and manages informants, and writes reports that will eventually be read by prosecutors and judges. These people do not have the dramatic story of the mob bosses. They do not have the atmosphere, the power, the movie-like seriousness of the men they chase. Their story is the story of following rules and patience and careful, sustained work. But they won against one of the most skilled criminal organizations in American history, operating at the height of its national power and at the peak of its financial skill. The investigators won. The Kansas City crime family, the organization that had survived Prohibition and the fall of the Pendergast machine and the Kefauver hearings and decades of federal attention, did not survive Operation Strawman. The law, patiently applied, finally won. Organized crime in America is a subject that the culture has returned to over and over again. In movies, in books, in long-form journalism, in television dramas, in podcasts, in true crime stories like this one, The Godfather and Goodfellas and The Sopranos and 100 other works of art have shaped the way that Americans think about the mob, giving it a mythology that is somewhere between history and fiction. The Kansas City story does not fit neatly into that mythology. It is not the Corleone family. No family of Sicilian nobility playing out an American tragedy of violence and blending in. It is not the raw street savagery of the New York families. It is something more specifically American, more specifically Midwestern, more specifically rooted in a particular mix of immigrant ambition and political corruption and economic opportunity that marked the American heartland in the early 20th century. What the Kansas City story tells us finally is about the relationship between criminal enterprise and legal institutions. Organized crime never operates in a vacuum. It operates in the spaces created by institutional failure, by political corruption, by not enough law enforcement, by economic systems that leave some communities without legal opportunities. Remove the Pendergast machine, and the Kansas City mob might not have established itself as powerfully as it did. Keep honest, strict casino rules in Nevada from the beginning, and the Las Vegas skimming operation never gets off the ground. The mob is a parasite. The parasites need a host. The lesson, if there is a lesson, and stories this complex do not always end neatly with lessons, is about the importance of the institutions that the mob used and corrupted. Clean government, honest law enforcement, strict financial rules. These things are not interesting. They do not make for dramatic stories, but they are the structure of the society that makes it harder for the parasites to get a hold. The federal government's campaign against organized crime from the creation of the FBI's organized crime program in the late 1950s through the RICO prosecutions of the 1980s was not perfect. It was sometimes too harsh. It sometimes targeted figures who were on the edge, while the real leaders escaped justice for years. But it worked. It actually really worked. The major organized crime families in America are shadows of what they once were, not because they ran out of criminal ambition, but because the institutional response to them improved enough to make the old model impossible to do. That is worth saying. That is worth honoring. Even in a story that is fundamentally about the criminals rather than about the investigators. There is one more thing worth saying before we step back entirely from this story. Kansas City is a wonderful city. It is a city of amazing jazz history. Charlie Parker was born there, and the jazz tradition that Kansas City developed in the 1930s was one of the great creative flowerings of American music. It is a city of beautiful architecture. The boulevards and fountains and parkways that were laid out in the grand, civic style of the early 20th century give it a physical character that is unlike almost any other American city. It is a city of passionate sports fans, of great barbecue, of the wide, flat, endlessly surprising beauty of the Missouri landscape. The mob was part of Kansas City's history. It shaped the city in ways that are still visible in certain buildings, in certain political traditions, in certain cultural memories. But it was never the most important part of the story. The most important parts of Kansas City's story are the music and the yelsi architecture and the civic life and the generations of people, Italian American and African American and Irish American and every other kind of American who built their lives there. The mob is a chapter in Kansas City's story. But Kansas City is much larger than the mob, and so we arrive at last at the end of this long story. We have traveled from the bootlegging operations of the 1920s to the Las Vegas counting rooms of the 1970s. We have met John Lazia, who built the first structure of organized crime power in Kansas City and died for it at 37. We have met Charles Benaggio, who reached too far for political power and paid with his life in the back room of a Democratic Party club. We have met Nick Savella, the most gifted and dangerous figure in the organization's history. Patient, precise, brilliant in his way, and finally unable to build something that would last longer than he did. We have met the investigators and the prosecutors whose years of patient, careful work brought the organization down. We have stood in the counting rooms where the skim was taken, and on the streets of Kansas City's north side, where the organization had its roots. We have watched the Las Vegas empire rise and fall. We have watched an organization born in the chaos and opportunity of Prohibition grow through the post-war years into a skilled national player. And then we have watched that player, like so many others in so many places and so many times, finally be held responsible. The story is over. The lights are lower now. The city is quiet. Somewhere in Kansas City, on a cold November night, the streets that once carried the long black cars of the Savella era are empty. And still, the buildings where the decisions were made stand, or have been replaced by other buildings. The men who made those decisions are gone. But the story remains. It always remains. And there we are. The full rise and fall of the Kansas City crime family. From John Lazia in the Prohibition-era bootlegging trade through Nick Savella's amazing time as one of America's most skilled crime bosses. Through the Las Vegas years and the Operation Strawman prosecutions, to the quiet gray fading of an organization that is now a ghost. If you stayed with this story until the very end, thank you, truly. You have no idea how much it means to know that you are out there in the middle of the night, wrapped up in a blanket somewhere, listening to these stories with the same love and care that I tried to put into telling them. Please drop a comment and tell me your favorite part of tonight's story. Was it John Lazia building the mob for nothing in the Prohibition years? Was it the Las Vegas, the shining, old machinery of the skim? Was it Nick Savella himself? That amazing, cold, brilliant, complicated man. I read every comment. Tell me what got to you. And if this story gave you something, if it kept you company tonight, if it took you somewhere interesting, if it made the hours a little more bearable, please hit the like button, subscribe if you have not already, and share this with a friend who loves true crime. That simple act really helps this channel reach more people and makes it possible for me to keep making stories like this one. Next time we go somewhere even darker. I cannot tell you where yet, but I can tell you this. It involves a city, a secret, a betrayal, and a name that most people have never heard. A name that, once you know it, you will never forget. Until then, rest well. The night is long, and you are safe. And the stories will always be here waiting for you. Good night.